Well, thank you, Jim. And thank you for inviting me to give a talk this year. It's been a while. And I just have to say, it's really great to see so much continued interest in this work group year after year. I've been around for 17 years now, and the crowd just seems to get bigger, or at least stay the same every year. So it's good to see all of you, good to be a part of it. This afternoon, I'm going to present our recent development of an Index of Physical Habitat Integrity, or IPI, and I'll also briefly describe how we might use it in monitoring programs. I should note that the index is still somewhat provisional, so we completed development a couple of months ago. Since then, we've been vetting the index, making sure that it works the way we want it to, that it's telling us what we think it should. And overall, I think that it seems to be working pretty well. I think it generally reflects where we were hoping to get with a physical habitat index. Although we are thinking about making some final tweaks to it to improve the way that it performs in certain settings, and I'll describe that at the end of the talk. And once again, I think about half the crowd is new to CABW, so I assume that not all of you live and breathe bioassessment. So with that in mind, let me just begin by briefly describing what we're talking about when we talk about physical habitat, or PHAB. So in the broadest sense, habitat in streams includes all physical, chemical, and biological attributes that influence or provide sustenance to organisms in the stream. Physical habitat is an operational definition that stream ecologists use to refer to just the structural attributes of habitat. So it typically excludes things like water chemistry and other water column attributes such as water clarity, temperature, light intensity. But it typically includes things like aquatic macrophytes, riparian vegetation, and woody debris measures, because those things have a big role in modifying habitat structure, light input, and providing nutrient input by way of organic material, even though they're actually biological measures. There are 8 general physical habitat attributes important in influencing stream ecology. So these are big drivers of the types of organisms you might expect to find in a stream. They are stream size and channel dimensions, channel gradient, substrate size and type, complexity and diversity of cover types, flow habitat complexity, so the alternation between fast water and slow water habitats, riparian vegetation cover and structure, anthropogenic alterations, and channel riparian interactions. Now that last one is really complex. We could do a whole session on just that topic and probably not do it justice. So it's really beyond the scope of this talk. It's beyond the scope probably of what we even measure in the field with our protocols. So I added it to the list just for the sake of completeness, but I won't actually say more about it this afternoon. Like biological attributes, all of these habitat attributes vary naturally according to the physiographic and climatic setting of a stream, except perhaps for anthropogenic disturbance, unless it's in the sense that humans tend to alter certain portions of the landscape and not others. So to visually drive home that point about natural variability, and because we as a lab have a vast wealth of underutilized field photos, I hope you guys will indulge me for a couple of minutes while I just run through each of these elements in turn. So stream size can vary from tiny little brooks that you could easily step across to large, barely wadable rivers that support recreational uses like rafting to medium-sized streams like in the lower right photo, which are kind of in between. Channel gradient varies from really steep cascading streams to streams that are so flat you have to measure slope with an auto level, and again we see everything in between. Substrate size can vary naturally from streams that are dominated by sand and fine sediment. The largest particles might be fine gravel at best. On the other end of the spectrum, you have streams where the median particle size is, the size of a refrigerator. And again, and I'll stop saying it, we see everything in between. Cover types include things like aquatic macrophytes and large boulders. Woody debris piles count as cover, like you can see in the background of that top right photo. Those provide great fish cover, and the submerged portions also support a lot of different aquatic macroinvertebrates. In that lower right photo, again, you can see aquatic macrophytes in the background, but in the foreground, where the water is really clear, all those small boulders, that counts as cover, and that great diversity of substrate particle size with all that interstitial space between the substrate particles, bugs love that. Flow habitat complexity varies from streams where you have really dramatic transitions from fast water riffle habitat straight into deep pools, like in that photo on the left. And by the way, that photo on the left also shows some great fish cover. So that deep pool, that deep shady pool with that overhanging vegetation, that's great fish cover. By contrast, some streams are naturally just 100% slow glide for at least the length of the sampling reach, if not more. Riparian vegetation structure and cover can vary from streams that have a multi-layer mature woody canopy along the entire sampling reach to other streams that are in more of a meadow setting. And so they basically don't have a riparian zone except for the sedges and the aquatic vegetation immediately adjacent to the stream. And of course, finally and sadly, there's no end to the way anthropogenic alterations modify the physical habitat that we see in streams. And I haven't been able, for the life of me, to figure out why those gals in the lower right are so happy to be in that stream. Since 2000, bioassessment programs have collected quantitative measures, or at least semi-quantitative measures, of physical habitat as a standard component of our field protocols. The current swamp protocols were most recently revised in 2016, but actually date back to 2007, and those in turn were derived from earlier EMAP protocols that, although not formally published until 2006, date back to at least 2000, if not the late 90s. And in those protocols, we measure all those things that I just described in the photos: channel dimensions, slope and bearing, substrate composition, etc. We also measure human disturbance in the riparian zone, and from that, we can calculate a riparian disturbance index. But I wanted the PHAB index to reflect response to human disturbance, not to integrate the disturbance itself. So I didn't actually use any of our human disturbance metrics as candidate metrics in IPI development. For those of you not familiar with our protocols, we measure physical habitat from 11 equally spaced transects, typically from within a 150 meter sampling reach, although for larger streams, we go 250 meters. We measure riparian characteristics from a 10 by 10 meter plot on either bank. In-stream channel measurements are measured from within the channel that associated with that 10 by 10 meter plot. Flow habitat diversity is measured for the entire area between transects, and then width and depth measurements and pebble counts are taken not only from locations along the transects themselves, but also from equally spaced intertransects. So the protocol generates a ton of transect-based observational data, excuse me, and from that, we can calculate reach scale averages of a lot of different individual PHAB components. And over the years, we've adopted many of these metrics from Phil Kaufman's manual, Quantifying Physical Habitat in Wadable Streams. So for example, we can calculate a metric called XFC-NAT. And that acronym, that shorthand, it's not important, it's just what we call it. But that's the mean aerial cover of natural cover types. We can calculate percent sand and fine substrate and other substrate metrics. We can calculate XPCMG, which is the proportion of reach that has all three canopy layers, and so on. And in the past, we've mostly used those as explanatory variables to evaluate how biota respond to different PHAB elements. We've even set exceedance thresholds for a few of them to include in relative risk assessments. So for example, how much sand and fines is too much sand and fines, and when you exceed that threshold, what's the additional risk of associated biological impairment? But we've never really tried to evaluate the performance of the individual endpoints, and by performance I mean, do they discriminate between reference sites, which have little or no human activity in the upstream watershed, and high activity, or what we call stress sites, that have a lot of human activity in the local or upstream watershed. We also have never evaluated them for bias. So do they vary so much naturally among ecoregions that you would have to correct for that if you wanted to incorporate them into an index? And we've certainly never tried to combine them into an index. So before I describe how we actually put the index together, let me just speak briefly about why we need a PHAB index and how we might use it in monitoring programs. And I think one of the biggest drivers is that we've long had this sense that we could do a lot more with all that PHAB data that we collect, to the extent that a few years back at this very conference, and I know a lot of you were here for this, Pete Odie likened the development of an IPI to finding the Holy Grail. So I guess we're done. We can all go home. No, but seriously. So we know that physical conditions are important habitat elements that, when intact, support healthy biological assemblages. We also know that habitat degradation and loss related to land use are among the leading problems associated with poor ecological condition. Well, we, as freshwater scientists and resource managers, are presumably working in support of the Clean Water Act to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And so, in the most basic terms, I think in order to maintain and restore physical integrity, we have to be able to measure it. So an easily interpretable index that integrates a number of different individual habitat attributes into an overall measure of physical condition could address several management objectives. So for example, we could use it in support of the State Water Board's 303D listing policy, which recommends that we evaluate physical habitat data and other water quality data to support conclusions about the status of a water segment. And that's exactly what Chad Laughlin described this morning when he told us about the development of biological objectives in the San Diego region, where for streams that are potentially impaired based on benthic macroinvertebrates, we could use a PHAB index as a secondary line of evidence to determine whether or not to list that stream. We could also use a PHAB index in support of regional report cards. So for example, the Central Coast has developed report cards as part of their Healthy Watersheds project that score the overall condition at a site based on a number of different indices and data types, including water chemistry, sediment chemistry, toxicity, and biology. And unfortunately, Karen Wooster couldn't make it to this workshop this year, but I know that she's been keen on integrating a PHAB index into their regional report cards because it concisely pulls together a bunch of different PHAB components and displays them as a single, easily interpretable number that you can evaluate side by side with all the other index scores to round out your impression of the condition at a site. And I know she also wants to use the index to support the habitat protection aspects of the Central Coast 2017 agricultural order, which I don't have time to talk about, but you can read all about it on their website. And I should also mention that Raphael Mazur and Ken Schiff in the South Coast are developing a regional report card type format to describe the overall condition at a site. And I think they are also interested in incorporating a physical habitat index as one of the components that goes into that overall assessment. And there are many other potential applications, but I'm limited on times. So back to index development. So our approach was similar to that we used for CSCI and ASCII. We wanted to model the expected metric values at reference sites based on natural gradients for metrics that had a significant amount of variation explained by the natural gradients. We wanted to use the metric residuals, that is the observed metric value minus the predicted metric value, to factor out that response. We wanted to select metrics that were non-redundant with one another and that best respond to stressor gradients. And we wanted to ensure that multiple types of metrics were included, so substrate metrics, cover metrics, riparian metrics, etc. And before I go on, I just want to remind everybody that the benefit of a modeling approach is that you get a site-specific expectation for every site. And by modeling out the response of metrics to natural gradients, what you're left with is a response just to human disturbance gradients, and that's what we want the index to reflect. Also, by factoring out response to natural gradients, it means that you don't have to develop a bunch of different indices for different portions of the state. So a given index score has a consistent meaning in all regions of the state. To be included in index development, projects had to have the full version of the current protocol, so field crews had to measure all PHAB elements. Watershed delineations had to be available, and all predictor variables and reference screening variables had to already be calculated, and that's mostly because I'm lazy and didn't want to do a bunch of additional GIS work to support index development. And we preferred that CSCI scores were already calculated, or at least easy to calculate with readily available bug data, because in the end, we want to know how biotic indices relate to a PHAB index. And then Rafi and I selected a short list of about 60 PHAB metrics to include in modeling based on, we thought they had a plausible response to human disturbance, we thought they were plausible drivers of biological condition, and we decided early on not to include velocity or depth measures because we weren't really trying to predict how much water was in a channel at a given time. We ended up with nearly 1,600 unique stations to use in model development, and they were pretty evenly divided between reference sites, intermediate sites, and high activity sites or stress sites. So again, reference sites have little or no activity in the watershed. Stress sites have a lot of activity in the watershed. The criteria we used were the same as those for CSCI development. We divided the data set into 80% calibration sites, which were used to develop the models and to establish the scoring system for each metric, and 20% validation sites, and the validation sites were used to verify that the final index, the performance characteristics of the final index weren't just a fluke. So that slide was a little cluttered. This is reference sites only. We had a pretty good geographic coverage of the reference site pool used to support index development, almost as good as what we had for CSCI. The predictor variables that we used were also similar to those we used for CSCI and ASCII. We basically wanted to use variables that humans can't alter, at least quickly. Many were GIS-based, things like latitude, longitude, elevation, climate, geology. But we also used a few field-based measures, and we thought that those field-based measures would be, or at least might be, really important in predicting local physical conditions. We haven't used field-based measures as predictors in previous index development. Briefly, the analysis steps, we used random forests to model the extent to which natural gradients explain variance in each p-hab metric. We constrained the models to between 1 and 10 predictors, and the preferred model was the one that had the fewest predictors and was within 2% of the best model error, root mean squared error. And that step was mostly just to try to minimize the number of predictors that would be included, to make it easier for people who want to use these models and use the index to actually use it and score it. So it was basically simplicity for its own sake. For metrics that had at least 20% of their variance explained by the models, we used the metric residuals. Again, that's the observed value minus the predicted value to score the metrics. Otherwise, we used the raw metric for scoring. And to actually score metrics, we used the method of COW from 2007, where for decreasing metrics, those that decrease in response to human disturbance gradients, we set the scoring floor as the 5th percentile of stress sites and the scoring ceiling as the 95th percentile of reference sites. For increasing metrics, those that increase in response to human disturbance, we did the exact opposite. We set the scoring floor as the 5th percentile of reference sites and the scoring ceiling as the 95th percentile of stressed. We evaluated metric discrimination using t-tests of the differences in means between reference and stress sites, and we evaluated metric bias using analysis of variance to check for differences in the mean score at reference sites among PSA regions. And so basically a good performing metric is one that shows good discrimination, has a high t-statistic between reference and stressed, but doesn't show bias among regions. So basically has the same mean score among ecoregions. I then chose the best performing metric or two from within each of the metric classes and checked to make sure that the chosen metrics were weakly correlated with one another. And the reason I put chose in bold there is because I used a little more best professional judgment to put the index together than what we've done for previous indices. So in the past, we've taken all possible combinations of good performing metrics and put them together in a bunch of different what we call proto indices. And then we've chosen the final index from a set of proto indices. What I did is chose the best metrics up front and then just developed a single index. So I assembled the final metrics into an index by taking the average metric score at each site and dividing that score by the mean score at reference calibration sites to standardize the index scores. In practice, the index scoring ranges from about a 0.15 at sites that have the worst p-hab to not quite a 1.3 at sites that have really good p-hab. The 10th percentile of reference site scores is a 0.85. The reason I mention that specifically is because we've used that percentile from other indices to establish informal provisional thresholds between degradation and non-degradation, impairment, non-impairment, whatever you want to call it. So for this index, a score of 0.85 could be a provisional threshold between good and bad p-hab. The selected metrics were evenness of flow habitats, which was an unmodeled decreaser, Shannon diversity of natural substrate types, which was also an unmodeled decreaser, percent sand and fine substrate, which was a modeled increaser. Now we know that sand and fines can actually be decreased in the environment compared to what it should be naturally based on some types of human alteration like below dams or in concrete lined channels, but that mostly wasn't supported by our data set. So sand and fines was predominantly an increaser, at least in the sites we had in our development set. And when we did try to score it as a bidirectional metric, it showed really strong bias among PSA ecoregions, which is weird, but we ended up treating it as an increaser. Now that does have some implications for index performance, and so I'm going to come back to percent sand and fines here in just a minute. We also included riparian cover, that is the sum of three layers, so ground level, medium level, canopy level, and finally Shannon diversity of natural cover types, and both of those last two were modeled decreasers. There were 12 final predictors. I won't go through all of these except to say that 2 of them were field measures and the rest were GIS measures. And the ones that have an asterisk are ones that we don't currently output as part of our standard output packages for CSCI index calculation. And it's just, I put that in there to annotate that we actually need to add those metrics to our standard output, again, to facilitate the use of these models and the final index. The index discriminated well between reference and stressed sites, not only in calibration data, which is in the plots at the upper left, but also in validation data, which are in the plots at the upper right. The index didn't show bias among PSA regions, so it had statistically the same mean score at reference sites among all of the ecoregions in the state. So reading from left to right across that x-axis, those abbreviations stand for Chaparral, Central Valley, which only had one reference site, Desert Modoc, North Coast, South Coast, and Sierra Nevada. And that lack of bias, which is a good thing, was true also in validation data, which is shown in the lower right plots. So this is discrimination part 2. So in these plots, I actually combined calibration and validation data for the reference and stressed boxes, but I added that intermediate plot. And believe it or not, that intermediate group actually has a significantly lower mean than does the reference group, according to post hoc analysis from ANOVA. But based on ocular analysis, I wouldn't say that's very satisfying. But I guess you can't have everything. And then, okay, this tidbit, I didn't know where else to include it, so I just threw it in this slide, even though it has nothing to do with those box plots. But we had more than 230 sites that had between 2 and 5 repeat visits over time, and the mean standard deviation of index scores from those repeat visits was less than 0.09. And that's as good as, maybe even a little better than what we've seen for CSCI. We also looked at the response of the IPI to continuous stressor gradients, so not just between categorical groups of sites, but to more continuous stressor gradients. So in these plots, I have IPI on the y-axis. On the left, it's plotted versus our riparian disturbance index. In the center, it's plotted versus percent impervious in the watershed, and on the right, it's plotted versus total watershed disturbance, which is the sum of ag, urban, and open developed space land use. And none of those plots are especially tight, but they're all highly significant. And as Kara indicated this morning when she was talking about CRAM, that's often as good as it gets in this business. I also plotted the PHAB index versus some of our other indices. So here, the PHAB index is on the x-axis. On the left, I've plotted it versus the H20 algae axis. That's the hybrid algae axis. In the center, I've plotted it versus CSCI, and on the right, I plotted it versus CRAM. And those relationships get stronger from left to right, and that supports previous evidence we've seen that bugs respond a little more strongly to PHAB than does algae. And it's perhaps not surprising that IPI and CRAM have the strongest relationship of all those indices. While they don't measure, they don't directly overlap in terms of what they measure, they do, I think you could argue, measure similar things in different ways. So in all, I think they actually complement one another pretty well. So thanks to some really careful and thorough feedback from some of our stakeholders in the South Coast, we have found some ways to potentially improve the PHAB index. And I think the biggest issue centers around the fact that we treated percent sand and fines as an increaser. So having less percent sand and fines than predicted is actually viewed as better, quote unquote. So just for example, there were a couple of streams in SoCal, one of which it's concrete lined on the banks, but it's got a soft bottom and a lot of aquatic macrophytes. And then the other one was just a straight up concrete channel. And the soft bottom channel initially got a score of 0.44, and the concrete channel got a score of 0.62. Now neither of these is a nice site, but that just seemed wrong. So one solution, and this was actually suggested to us by one of our stakeholders, is to add percent sand and fines plus percent concrete. So, calculate that metric based on the sum of percent sand and fines plus percent concrete, because, conceptually they both represent the same thing, which is the absence of suitable substrate to support aquatic life. So we tried it. And after the concrete correction, the IPI score dropped to a 0.35, and so we felt a lot better than that. So originally that higher score in the concrete channel was pretty much driven by, the sand and fines metric. So this is one candidate solution we've come up with. Another solution is to just institute a so-called kill switch for concrete line channels, where they basically score a 0 for the substrate metrics. And so in closing, I want to acknowledge all the field crews that collect, that do these protocols, that collect physical habitat data, because it can be grueling work. Coordination of field work can be really challenging, but in particular, I want to acknowledge our 4 field leads. Sean McBride has been with us for 17 years now. Jen York and Glenn Sibbald have been with us for nearly that long. Nathan Mack is the new guy, and he's been with us for, I think, a decade now. And these guys and gal spend all summer, every summer, out in the field. They're away from their families, away from their pets, and I think they really deserve a lot of recognition. And so I don't mean to sound presumptuous, but if you find it in your hearts to applaud at the end of this talk, I ask that you make it for them, because they really deserve it, and they're the backbone of our statewide programs. So with that, I'll close, and thanks for listening.
Questions?
You didn't stand up. I must have gone really quick.
I was about to stand up. You did good. Okay. In fact, you were perfect. He was perfect. The presentation was perfect.
Perfect, Andy.
Wow.
Are you at all familiar with the Arizona DEQ physical habitat protocol and how they structured the data? I was curious if you were,
Short answer,
if you could give
no.
an opinion on it. Okay.
Sorry.
No worries.
Okay.
I spent the summer in Navajo collecting their protocol, and I've got a lot of data.
If it was at all derived from EMAP protocols, then yes, because ours are based on EMAP, and I'm familiar with the EMAP protocols. But if it's completely independent, then no, I'm not familiar at all. Then no.
Okay.
Yeah, one more question, 2 more questions, but that's it.
It looked like a couple of the metrics were kind of spoke to watershed position, the bank full width and the elevation. Do you think that's partly because lower in the watershed tends to be more developed, or are they independent?
No, they can't be independent. I mean, that's definitely, a confounding covariance. I'm not sure how to, I'm not sure how to factor that out of a final index. Having reference sites at low elevation is the key, but those are few and far between in lots of regions. think Rafi might have something to say towards that, though.
Yeah, I would just say on a statewide scale, they were actually remarkably poorly correlated with each other, just because like you can get a 5-meter wide bank at different positions of different watersheds throughout the state. So effectively, while there is that kind of correlation, it doesn't end up having a very high R-squared in any sort of traditional way you'd look for it. I'd also say that the modeling approach that we used, random forest, it has a sort of intrinsic way of sort of accounting for highly correlated predictors and only focusing on the predictors that are providing unique information. So the influence is reduced, I would say.
Thanks, Rafi.
Right here, one last
And can you get your slides back up? I just have a question.
Let me try.
Does it have to?
No, you don't have to, but I guess my question was, I was going to challenge you a little bit because you were saying that you had a little bit of a less relationship with algae, and it actually looks like you have a threshold relationship with algae. There's a, like, you know, where you, at some point with age 20, it really just drops off, and I was curious to understand what's that about?
The drop-off?
Yeah, I mean, it was actually like, so, anyway, so maybe we can chat about it later, but.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think my comment was driven entirely really by just the R-squared value. I didn't, you know, I mean, I forced a linear I mean, those are
Right.
not linear relationships. I just like forced that smoother.
Okay.
And so based that statement on just the R-squared. But, you know, if we tried a different approach,
Yeah.
they may respond identically. But we have seen, you know, this isn't the first time we've seen CSCI responding, you know, a little more strongly to
Maybe at
PM.
least in terms of a linear way, but then it seems like you actually did have, you know, almost like a break point.
Okay.
With
In
your.
both plots.
I zeroed in on the algae because I was
Okay.
interested in that.
Okay.
So, okay, thanks.